Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. With only a couple weeks before the election, of course, politics is on our mind. And a couple of weeks ago, I was lucky enough to be scrolling on TikTok and discover someone whose handle was Drew X Deficit, who has just done incredible content about who has done incredible content about Watchmen, specifically the comic book, though also sometimes about how the movie or the TV show does or does not well represent it. And been doing a fun series about how would different Watchmen vote? What are the political themes of the Watchmen? What are the stories that the comic book The Watchmen was talking about in the 1980s that are or not still relevant today? And why is this work so often not only kind of dismissed as a work of kind of political commentary, but often deeply misunderstood? And I'm lucky enough that I have Drew Maxey of Drew X Deficit on TikTok and other places here. Drew, say hello.
Hello. How are you?
Doing well. Glad to be having this conversation. We've had a couple times trying to schedule it, so I really appreciate your patience and
no worries.
Get to work on.
Listen, you give me a chance to discuss Watchmen. It doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter how many times you got to reschedule it. I'm going to take it.
I love it. Well, tell me a little bit about you in terms of your background with kind of analysis stuff, or how you got into Watchmen.
Sure. So, I mean, I've always been really interested in reading and writing. When I was very young, I was always I always told people I was going to be a writer of some kind. And I think, when you want to write, the most important thing that you can do is just read a lot. Yeah. And I will say I'm not the most well-read person ever. It's just, there's a lot of stuff that I quote unquote should have read by this point that I just haven't.
Right.
And a lot of that is because there are a lot of classics that just I really don't feel like I need to read. Like somebody else has already done all that work for me.
Yeah. That's fair.
And that kind of brings me to what made Watchmen stand out for me. Is it not to say that Watchmen isn't also heavily publicized, because it definitely is. But I will say that it feels like there's a big lull of time where people really weren't talking about it anymore. And that's kind of when I discovered it, which was right around the time of the movie coming out. Right. A little bit before the movie came out, I was just getting into comics as a storytelling medium. And I was pretty much only reading superhero comics and the occasional crime comic. And I knew the movie was coming out, and it was kind of just I feel like I should have read this up by now kind of thing. And I knew that the movie seemed like a big deal that it was being released. So I went and bought a copy, and that's this copy that I have right here. This hardcover is from 2008.
Nice.
And I read it, and I was completely amazed by it. Not just the plot, but the storytelling techniques that went into making it. And I didn't know anything about Alan Moore. I didn't know who Dave Gibbons was. None of that stuff. It was just all very kind of on the surface, and then realizing that there was so much more to get into. And I always kind of knew that I wanted to be a teacher, but I was at that point in my life, I was a college dropout. And I always kind of said, I'm going to go back to school eventually, but I don't know when. And reading Watchmen was one of the things that was
wow.
I have to go back to school because this is something that has to be in a classroom. And it kind of inspired me to get back into my studies and finish school, which I didn't do right away, but I did eventually. And it was the light at the end of the tunnel was always, someday I'm going to teach Watchmen, and I don't care what I have to do to make that happen. I'm going to do it. And so
hold on one second. Hey, Riki, welcome. Sorry, I thought you had the link, and I wasn't sure if you were joining us or not. Drew, this is Riki, my co-host.
Hello.
I caught some of that, and I'm very excited to hear more.
All right, let me bring you in, Riki. So I'll go back to recording. Drew, that sounds awesome. And I have really good news, actually. I wasn't sure if Riki, my co-host, could join us, but Riki is able to chime in, and Riki's been hearing some of that part. So, Riki, let me ask you, what's kind of been your connection to the story of Watchmen?
I came to it pretty late. Like I didn't read it when it came out. I think maybe the hearing that a movie was coming up prompted me to finally pick it up, because obviously like it's so influential in the
Mhm.
comic book landscape that I was familiar with, the iconic cover and the name Alan Moore. And I would say I enjoyed the movie, but I love reading the graphic novel. And I think the differences in the two are interesting, and their places in history of media is very interesting. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, and I'll say you two are both more well read on this, quite literally, which I really appreciate. So for myself, as I've told others, Drew, I'm not much of a comic book reader. The medium has just never really clicked in my brain. But I love hearing others talk about it, and I love the stories that they inspire. And so I watched the Watchmen movie when it came out, and I liked a lot of it. I kind of had some questions about, telling a story about the fear of something that actually didn't happen that we now know, decades later. But I enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed the kind of stuff it set up at the end. But then, when I thought we were going to have these great conversations about what is it okay to do in the face of an existential threat, most of the conversation was about, oh, it's not as good as the comic book. And I kind of let it go at that point, especially because I wasn't a big Zack Snyder fan and some of the other stuff, until I watched the recent TV show. I guess recent, it's been a couple of years now. And I know that there's now been yet another thing that's come out that I haven't seen yet, that this is going to be hopefully the first of a couple episodes with Drew. And I definitely will watch that for one of those coming up. But it got me to really interested in the story. And so by this point, I've read kind of a lot of plot summaries of it and a lot of like discussions about it and stuff like that. And I really just loved hearing you talk about it, Drew. Um, and today, I think the topic of how the movie differs from the book has been discussed kind of ad infinitum. And I don't want to necessarily go over that, but I'll start by just saying, particularly in terms of this topic we're going to discuss about the political messaging of this work, for people who've just watched the movie, what do you think they've missed?
That's a great question, because it's tough to assess that, because there are some people, I think, who will pick up on some of the more latent messaging that is in it. But overall, I think that the movie does kind of skim past a lot of the like more the smaller details of the politics involved. Like the and I do want to preface this as saying I actually enjoy the movie quite a bit.
Yeah.
I think I watch it frequently from time to time. I know that there are things that the book is going to do better, and there are some things that I just flat out do not like about the film. But overall, I think that aesthetically it's very pleasing, and that's kind of the best thing that it has going for it, is that it's very pretty to look at. The way that it visually represents Rorschach in terms of like the costume, I think is very, very cool. Dr. Manhattan, I think, looks incredible. And there's some really good casting in the movie itself. What it seems to leave out is, I mean, I think that the movie doesn't really make the case that Rorschach is this like far right kind of reactionary, you could say libertarian at best, outright fascist at worst.
Yeah.
And I think that is missing from the movie, minus a few lines that kind of hint at it.
Yeah.
A lot of people say that visually it does make, like, in terms of like visual storytelling, it props up Rorschach as this like great principled hero. I think that it does not show the hypocrisy of Rorschach. And I think in the book, Rorschach is made out to be like a glaring hypocrite in many, many different ways. There's a lot of because each issue of the book features these like kind of world building pages where it's like, oh, it could be like text from somebody's autobiography or like a psychological evaluation, or even like interviews with different characters that are supposed to be taken from like in-world magazines. There's a lot of plot stuff that is completely missing from that, but there's also a lot of the I'll give you a very specific example. Revolves around Rorschach. Rorschach in the movie, or in Watchmen, just in general, he has a trusted news source, which is called the New Frontiersman. And the only thing we know about the New Frontiersman is that for like the first few issues is that he reads it every day, and we start getting some hints that like the owner of the New Frontiersman is like, or the editor-in-chief is just kind of like a rough around the edges dude who likes to yell at people.
Right.
In issue I believe 7 of the book, we actually get to see them like an early print of the New Frontiersman, and it the story that they're working on, which is by this editor-in-chief, is like about how the vigilantes, which are now ruled illegal by something called the Keene Act, they need to come back because we need these American heroes with their masks to come in and like clean up the streets. And then if you read it, he goes on to say that like, you know, the masked hero, these characters are a lot like another group of people who were just trying to save their town from rampant crime, and they had to wear masks to do it. And he's talking about the Ku Klux Klan,
right?
Which, you know, he says like, oh, you know, they went and did some crazy things later, but when they first started, they were just trying to save themselves, you know. And it's like they were just trying to save their town from these criminals that the government was going to do nothing about, you know. And it's like extremely racist. It compares these superhero characters favorably to the Klan, which the character Hooded Justice, who is supposed to be the first in-universe costumed vigilante, you know, he wears a noose around his neck and he has like a purple costume that looks like a Klansman costume.
Yeah.
It is not subtle at all. This is Alan Moore making a comparison that masked vigilantes in America can be traced back to the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
In terms of you know, the type of, if you really broke down the politics of the way that they react to crime, it's not just appearance wise. There is a similarity that you could argue is there, and it takes writers who are more left leaning to really beat that out of the history of the character, to take that out of the story. That's totally missing from the movie because you don't get to see some of this behind the scenes sort of material.
Right.
And in fact, if I may, I believe in the movie, the character Hooded Justice speaks with what sounds like a German accent. He
does.
So it takes the Americanness out of it.
Yeah, and Hooded Justice in the story in Watchmen is a character that nobody ever learned who he was. Nobody ever learned his secret identity. And so they speculate that he was this German strongman performer named Rolf Muller. Nobody knows for sure, but everybody thinks that that's who it is. And then some of the things that like some of the evidence for that is like, oh, he spoke with a German accent, and he maybe was sympathetic to the German cause during World War II. And you know, some of the things that people said, or some of the things that people heard him say, was like, oh, we really shouldn't be attacking, going after the Nazis, you know, stuff like that.
A couple things I just want to jump in with. First of all, if you've not seen the TV show of Watchmen, definitely do that. It takes a very interesting take on Hooded Justice's story that we'll discuss in a different episode. I also just want to add as a bit of context, because one of the things I think is really interesting about the book and then to the movie is that, as you'd expect, it's very much laden with the imagery and the ideas and sort of the topics, not even topics, but more just kind of like the phrases that would mean a lot to someone who understood 1980s politics that might be lost, I think, on a lot of people reading it today. And so, for example, the term frontiersman in the 1980s, that would have been very much understood as a reference to Reagan and the kind of cowboy ethos and the kind of like neo-libertarian, the kind of like proto-libertarian, the things that would become the militias, on the border and stuff like that. Masked vigilantes again. So that just adds a lot. And the third thing I want to add, and go ahead, Drew, if you want to.
I was going to say too, the original superhero team within the world of Watchmen is called the Minutemen, and the Minutemen got their name for they were the original militia.
Right.
And in some people, in some cases, the name Minutemen was co-opted to eventually be Border Patrol.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things that I don't even know if this was an intentional reference, but Minutemen was also in the late 70s and 80s the name of one of the most controversial nuclear weapons that we had, because it was positioned kind of right as close to Russia as we could get.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. So.
Oh yeah, the Minutemen missile was a big thing.
Yeah, because the original name, the Minutemen, you're saying the original militia, going back to the Revolutionary War.
Right.
The idea behind the name was that they could be prepared to fight in a minute. Yeah, right. They were a very prepared force. So I think the use of that for like an early retaliation missile system in Europe is harkening back to that.
There's also, there's so much just from like the literary perspective is that like clocks and time are incredibly important to the book, to the point where they're hidden on almost every page. And so in times where they needed references to time in the dialogue as well to really like sync, it's almost subliminal to put that in your brain that there is this countdown happening. That's why there are issues, because it's the 12 numbers on the clock. It's why the the smiley face badge kind of reminds you of, with the blood kind of in the 11 o'clock position, kind of approaching midnight. Like it's all over the place. They do this very well in the television show as well, by adding the ticking sound in the background of some scenes, which I think works perfectly, because it doesn't, you can't have all the clocks just showing up all over the place subliminally, because it would look, you would light the scene weird. It would look different and stuff like that. But yeah, all of this stuff eventually, like in that way, the book is constructed so incredibly, because it is the name Minutemen. Not only is that reference to time, but it also has this reference to early America, as if to say like that these sort of characters are naturally bound to the history of the country, and that criticism that, because Watchmen is ultimately a criticism of not just superhero comics as an idea, but it's a criticism of authority. And so that criticism of authority has to be bound to the nation's beginnings, because it's always there.
Well, and I think it is so vital, because sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second there. With the Minutemen and I think that's such an important thing to understand, and to also understand about the 1980s, because I think if you watch the movie or you read the comic book, the first thing you learn that, for those who were born later may not be quite as visceral, of just like the nuclear terror that most of us were in, the 60s, the Cuban Missile Crisis and all of that. But then in the 70s, we went through détente and there was some peacemaking. And then Reagan really ratcheted it up, and he started building all these new weapons and challenging the Soviets. And for a lot of people, I never hid under my desk as a student in the 1980s, but I certainly was having, all my friends were talking about like, what would happen if the bomb fell and stuff like that. But I think it's easy to just think that's the only context of this. But another big part of it is, and again, it's part of why I think it's so relevant today, a lot of talk about, protecting America, because we are being invaded by immigrants, by Black people who don't know their place, by, women wanting to come out of the home, all this kind of stuff. And so a lot of this kind of like the reference to the Sons of Liberty, to the Minutemen and all that, is all wrapped up in all of this kind of like racist idea of protecting an idea of America. And if any of that sounds familiar to you, the Great Replacement theory has its roots in the kind of stuff we're talking about. All this is all very, very connected.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that makes Watchmen stand the test of time is that and why the 2019 television show worked as well as it did is because these criticisms of authority continue and they evolve, but sometimes they stay the same as much as they evolve.
Right.
And so like we now live as Americans, and I, the British as well have dealt with this in the recent past. This like uber conservative administration, these conservative administrations that are like taking over, and not just presidents, but we also have like senators and representatives who are following in their wake, and that's in turn kind of normalizing this to
right.
To the everyday person. And as much as like as much as you a sensible person in my eyes is resistant to these ideas, the fact that they're there all the time now just kind of desensitizes us to them.
Yeah.
And so like a Donald Trump figure doesn't seem crazy to me right now, even though on paper he absolutely should.
Right.
And that's a really scary thing. That's our nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we didn't stop it.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to get more into that. And I also just want to say that the question of the timeliness of it and how much it's aged well, I do have a question there that I want to dig into you with, and that's going to be in our members section. Sure. And just for those who don't know, this podcast is free for everyone, but we do have a membership program for this podcast and my Star Wars, and for this podcast and my Star Wars Generations podcast. For only $5 a month, $55 a year, you become a member. You get access to bonus content that we do at the end of episodes. You get some bonus episodes that we've been doing in the Star Wars podcast, and Ricky and I will be starting up pretty soon for this podcast. And of course, you just get to help support the podcast. We've been updating the sound equipment, a lot of the other stuff, and your memberships really go so far to help that happen and to just help us keep the lights on. So if you have a moment, please check out theethicalpanda.com. Think about becoming a member. And as I said, we'll have our bonus content at the end of this episode for members specifically. Let's get back to the character of Rorschach, because one of the things that I think I heard you say this some months ago, because actually I realized it was a lot longer than I'd mentioned earlier that I've been following your stuff, but maybe it was from someone else. But they made the point that, and I think this is kind of like a larger media question, one of the things that happens in the movie is that Rorschach is, for all intents and purposes, the protagonist.
Yes.
And certainly he's the narrator, and that there is just a certain level of sympathy and affection you're going to have for a character as that happens. And then, of course, as we said, he gets to make this like deeply ethical stand that he's the one person who won't submit to the lie and is literally murdered for it. Tell me more about how you feel like that how that contributes to people not sort of getting what Rorschach was and what Alan Moore is trying to say with him.
Well, I think that Rorschach, everything that you're saying about Rorschach also happens in the book. He is the only narration throughout the course of the book is the majority of it is from Rorschach's journal. And then one chapter of it is from Dr. Manhattan's perspective. And then one chapter of it is from Ozymandias's perspective, and his is spoken out loud, like he's having a conversation with somebody. That's that's all the narration that we get. The rest of it is kind of told through just using the visuals and connecting it back to things that people are saying in the scene. And so Rorschach is absolutely the protagonist of the book and the movie as well. I think in saying all that, I completely forgot what your question was.
Oh no, it was just I'll reframe it by responding to that. I totally get what you're saying. I guess to me, and I thought it was you who was making this point. Maybe it was a different creator, but either way, it was one I really connected with. there's something about the narration on a page doesn't connect you directly to a character as much, I think, as like when it is that character verbally narrating it in a movie.
Sure.
I was gonna ask, do you think there's a functional difference between a character being the protagonist and being the point of view character?
Oh, that's a good question.
I think that's a huge literary theory question.
Yeah.
in my eyes, I would say if they are the chief character, they are the protagonist. Doesn't mean that they're always right or that they're the hero, but I think that if we are meant to, if we spend more time with them than anybody else, they're probably the protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because I would argue that like a similar thing has happened with Fight Club, right? Between the novel and the movie, and how people perceive the kind of the correctness of the main character.
Sure. I mean, hold on here. I got this is my gold leaf copy of Fight Club.
Nice. Okay.
That Chuck Palahniuk sent me. So if you depending on how much time you got, I can respond to Fight Club as well.
We do weekly episodes, so.
But yeah, I do think that there is a disconnect, and I think if I'm just being honest, I think that disconnect comes from people thinking that visual media is not as smart as whether it be a comic or a film, that visual media isn't as smart as like
literature.
Like a prose novel.
Yeah.
And I think that comes down to just people think that because it has pictures that it must be, quote, easier. And if it's easier, then it doesn't warrant deeper analysis. And if it doesn't warrant deeper analysis, it must be because that wasn't its intention. And I know that's it's a long way of saying that people look at something with pictures and think, I don't need to read that far into it. And so they'll look at Rorschach. Rorschach ostensibly is a very cool design. He has a very cool, very interesting look. And I think for some people, that's all they need. They just need him to look cool, and that must mean that he's right. And so when you have this narration on the page where he is telling you everything that you need to know about him, or hearing it, from Jackie Earle Haley's narration, which is very good. He's the highlight of that film for sure. Maybe they just don't put together. They don't put together the hypocrisy or the far right messaging that is coming from Rorschach. But also, I think that in the United States, we do a really bad job of telling people what the difference between far right and far left are. Or just right and left in general. I teach high school. I teach a media literacy class. They're 17, 18 years old. And if you ask them what's a liberal and what's a conservative, they don't know. So it's something that you kind of just have to figure out by being already interested in wanting to know what that is. The average person, I don't think would know far right talking points. So when he says things like, like the page one, that everybody had a choice. They could have followed in the footsteps of good men like my father or President Truman, decent men who believed in a day's work for a day's pay. Instead, they followed the droppings of lechers and communists and didn't recognize that the trail led over a precipice until it was too late. That to me is an immediate, I know this guy's politics.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But I don't think that we teach to people what a fascist is. We don't teach the political spectrum. We don't teach what a communist is. And so it's very hard for somebody to recognize that if they're like the dog whistle that comes from, I'm going to rail against communism, that is probably a pretty good indication that this person has fascist sympathies.
Well, especially because I wonder now, I hadn't realized that he's the son of President Truman, because I don't think that's mentioned.
He's not the son of President Truman. he says early on page 1, he's writing in his journal, and he mentions good men like my father or President Truman.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Well, either way, the reference to President Truman, I think, is kind of wonderfully ironic because,
Of course it is.
yes, Truman was very anti-communist, but was also the person who integrated the military, who pushed for all sorts of, like, he was a huge union guy, did all sorts of things like that.
The only reason he likes Truman, there's 2 reasons why he likes Truman. The first is that he thinks his dad worked for President Truman, and he didn't.
Right.
He doesn't know who his dad is. His dad was just some guy who got his mom pregnant and left. And because Rorschach hinges so much on, like, his belief about himself is just like, I have to be a man like my dad. So he, like, made up this character because that's what masculinity is to him. Masculinity is violent and it kills people. That's what he thinks masculine is. And so, like, he likes President Truman because this fake dad that he made up so that he can live in his image worked for him. And secondly, he likes President Truman because he ordered the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The irony of that, because Rorschach is like, no, we can't let this terrible thing happen that's going to kill all these people. You have to, like the justification for the bombs, the nuclear weapons during World War II is, if we don't do this, more people will die.
Right.
That's the exact
Ozymandias' justification.
It is the justification that Ozymandias gives, and Rorschach thinks that it's wrong. At the end, it is this. This is what I'm saying. Like, this is Rorschach's hypocrisy. He will cling to a lie that he made up himself if it makes him feel better. But when he's given the exact same situation 5 days later, like a couple weeks later, he can't go for it. And he doesn't. He cannot recognize that is. He can't recognize that those situations are similar, because in one situation they're killing foreigners who don't look like him, and in the other situation they're killing Americans. And it's, but he also, in that same breath, in that very famous first couple lines, he's saying, like, the liberals and the intellectuals and the smooth talkers who have nothing to say, like, they made their choice. They followed these communists. And when it comes down to it, they're going to ask me to save them. And I'm going to look down from up above, because he sees himself as above these people. I will look down and whisper no. Like, he just won't save them because they don't align with what he thinks a person should be. Again, all this hypocrisy just comes out throughout the book. So when people say Rorschach is the only one of them with any morals or backbone or anything, it's because they don't understand him. They don't get what the character is supposed to be. The character is a criticism of moral absolutism and how that inevitably will make you a hypocrite. It's also a critique of Steve Ditko's politics. Steve Ditko, who created, the co-creator of Spider-Man and The Question and Blue Beetle, like, he left comics, mainstream comics anyway, because he didn't like how liberal they were. He eventually went on to be a total recluse. He didn't leave his house. He just worked on his comics after getting into, he got into Ayn Rand and became an objectivist. And he started, he felt that he could not work in a medium that allowed bad people to do good things. So, like, there's a very famous story about, like, he's drawing Spider-Man, and because of the Marvel method, the way that Stan Lee would write is essentially script, and, like, he would outline a story and then give it to his artists to draw, and they were in charge of the major beats. And then he would come back in and fill in the dialogue, right?
Right.
Ditko draws this story where Spider-Man at one point is swinging over a group of college protesters. And he writes, in that moment, he wants Spider-Man to be saying, those damn hippies, why don't they go out and get a job and stop ruining everything for real Americans? Stuff like that. And Stan Lee, being one of those hippies, writes the dialogue. It's like, oh, good for you kids for making your voices heard, you know? And it infuriated Steve Ditko that was not what he believed a superhero was. A superhero was not somebody who challenged authority. A superhero was somebody who made bad things happen to bad people, who punished bad people. So he, makes the character the Question at DC, at Charlton, who eventually was purchased by DC, and then decided that he couldn't live in those parameters anymore. It wasn't morally right for him. So he goes and creates a character named Mr. A, who is Rorschach. He looks just like Rorschach, except he has no black in his mask. That was Steve Ditko worked on Mr. A up until he couldn't anymore.
Yeah. There's a couple things I want to jump in here with, but Riki, first, I want to give you a chance to respond to a whole bunch of things.
I recognize that I am very long-winded, especially when you're talking about stuff I like. So if ever you're just like, listen, you got to shut up, just let me know.
No, we all are on the podcast, so it's great.
Yeah. What do you want me to say?
I just want to I'll edit that and take if you want me to jump in instead.
No, I mean, that was such a wonderful segment. I'm just in awe of the knowledge and the depth, because I knew about the Question. Like, I did not know about this Mr. A character. To me, like Rorschach is the Question, like this masked conspiracy nut.
He is very much inspired by the Question, but Mr. A is this other, like, Alan Moore has this very strange relationship with Steve Ditko. They never knew each other. But he was such a fan of Ditko's art, but he hated his politics because they were completely different. But at the same time, he was like, I admire the fact that he would quit working for the sure thing to go and push his far right agenda in his own comics. And so even though like Alan Moore found Ditko's politics to be pretty reprehensible, there was still something about it that he found so interesting. And so people will always look at Watchmen as a whole as a criticism of superheroes. And it definitely is, but it's a love letter to them as well.
Yeah, sure.
It really, you cannot do, I refer to Watchmen as parody of superhero all the time. And I don't think that parody necessarily means funny. It definitely has humorous moments in it. Like the fact that Night Owl looks stupid in his costume, like that he looks dumb in his costume, and that's on purpose. But I still think that it is parody because they are almost like funhouse mirror versions of recognizable superheroes who would have been recognizable at the time when it was published.
Right. Because Night Owl is Batman.
Night Owl's Blue Beetle.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fair too. I always thought of him as Batman, but like not as adept at his craft.
I mean, I think more than anything, I can see him as both Batman and Blue Beetle, but more than anything, what he's not is not macho.
Yeah, he's not
a picture. And I think in some ways it's a perfect contrast to Rorschach, who is himself kind of small and diminutive, but is obviously leading back to these ideas, the great American heroes, the John Waynes, which are all kind of big and muscular. And, again, if they're anything like what they are in on the page as they are in the movie, Night Owl is, he kind of fumbles things when this beautiful woman is attracted to him. He stumble and he and Rorschach are clearly friends and are kind of like playing off of each other. But like compare his masculinity to...
That is a thing that I do not like from the movie.
Okay.
They're represented to be like more friendly with each other in the movie than they are in the book. In the book, Night Owl is kind of just like, Rorschach's just a guy I used to do things with.
And that's also, I think, really important because his friendship with Night Owl completely humanizes him in the movie.
Yeah.
But either way, like, I don't think his language was being used at the time, but like he's very much a strong masculinity, but a soft masculinity, like a non-toxic masculinity in some ways, particularly when compared to Rorschach and the Question. Not the Question, the comedian.
Yeah, and you know, I always say that like if you were to align them politically, you know, like uh, Dan Dan's a pretty liberal guy.
Yeah.
He's not quite the strong liberal that Ozymandias is. But he's, you know, he's pretty forward thinking. He tries to be progressive. He has issues with his sexuality
Mhm.
that are not necessarily that he's like a closeted homosexual or anything like that. He's definitely like a straight man, but he deals with issues of like another thing that's kind of left out of the movie, but it's there in the book, is that he has a kink. Like he
Mm,
doesn't recognize that he is necessarily like a kinky dude, but he is, and he embraces it eventually.
mm,
Um, Whereas in the movie, it's kind of just treated as like, oh, putting on the costume and saving people excites him and makes him feel like he got his groove back. In the book, it is heavily implied that he is like sexually aroused by wearing a costume
mm.
and
That's right. Yeah.
and saving people and doing good because it makes him feel manly.
Mm,
And uh, there's a um, I lost my train of thought. What was I saying? There is this implication that like he is sexually aroused by this, and so then there's a broader implication. We talk about this whenever because I will not let this go. I don't let the students, like when we read Watchmen, I do not let them brush this under the rug. There is something kind of gross about like knowing that this superhero who, let's say, comes out and saves you. Yes, he does save you, but he's also kind of getting his jollies from it too.
mm.
And so there's like that makes it kind of self-serving, which means that he's probably a better hero than somebody like Rorschach, but he's not totally altruistic.
Yeah.
He's getting something out of this, you know?
And I like that as well because it kind of shows that, because like I said, like in the movie, I think Night Owl is kind of like probably the best person in the movie, other than
Yeah.
perhaps Silk Spectre. And like having him also have this kind of like a dark secret that is kind of like, and again, like not to kink shame, like the kink itself, there's nothing wrong with, but you're right. Like if he's choosing to do like, I'm going to go out and help others,
Right.
but actually it's something that I do for myself. And to some extent, like there's a scene in the movie that's basically like him flirting um with is it Silk Spectre?
Yeah,
I get the two
yeah.
women characters mixed up. Silk Spectre is the daughter, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And the mother.
Right.
They were
So
both, yeah.
him flirting with, Silk Spectre Jr. is basically him finding a bunch of like, street thugs who are not like great people, but I don't think necessarily deserve the death penalty, and quite
Yeah.
clearly killing them in horrible, brutal ways.
Which is crazy, by the way, that they put that in the movie. I don't know why they first of all, that's another criticism of the movie. They're like, yeah, they're killing them. They're like twisting their heads all the way around, which implies that they have super strength, and they don't. In the book,
Yeah.
they just kind of fight them off, and
Yeah.
that's it. But the sexual tension there is it's one of my favorite sections of the book, is because this is happening concurrently with Dr. Manhattan's interview. And you can see the way that like the language of the interview and what's going on there is actually like adding to the sexual tension because of the specific wording that they're using. Like when somebody says to Dr. Manhattan, like, do you think you gave Janie Slater cancer, your old girlfriend Janie Slater cancer by sleeping with her? And his handler says, we're not here to comment on intimate moments. And that caption box of the intimate moments is placed over the two of them, like sharing this glance after they've clearly just like become sexually aroused by.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's like one of the things that Watchmen does so well is that when I do it in class, I refer to it as the interactivity between the image and the text. Which if you read like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, he has a totally different name for this. I just didn't know what it was called for years. And I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but essentially like one of the the secondary reason why Watchmen as a book exists is because Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons wanted to create a showcase of all the different storytelling techniques that you could only do in comics. Some of them are similar to what you could do in a movie or a regular book, but they're not the same. And so by highlighting them throughout the course of this book, they've created essentially like the handbook on how you tell stories in comics and make them literary. And one of the things that they do is they are constantly putting text that is unrelated to what's happening to what you're seeing. But when you place them together, you inevitably juxtapose them and have to create some kind of commentary between them. And that's one of the best times that it happens is during that fight sequence. And it's gone from the movie. And it would be so easy to do with voiceover, but unfortunately it's not there.
And this is why traditionally people claimed that Watchmen was unfilmable. Like that is the phrase that was attached to it for such a long time.
It truly is.
While I enjoyed the movie, I do think that it failed as an adaptation because of these fundamental irreconcilable issues that you can't translate.
This is a very different style. And I'm not saying it would work, but I would kind of... as someone who hasn't really understood comics but wants to know more about them, one of my favorite comic book movies is both of the Into the Spider-Verse movies, because those feel like they're coming the closest to bringing the comic book to the screen. You know, like when he throws the bagel and it hits his head, and literally the sound effect bagel happens on the screen. And maybe a part doing it in animation would also help. But I kind of would want, like, it's very different content, but we kind of love to see like that animation team take a shot at Watchmen, just because they're probably not doing it enough, but still they're going further, I think, than most. The thing about Watchmen, the whole like question of it being unfilmable, it is unfilmable. It cannot be the content of Watchmen cannot be separated. The storytelling of Watchmen cannot be separated from the comic book medium. You can do things that are very similar, and in some ways, one of the reasons why I love the 2019 HBO show is because they recognized there are some things you can do in both, or you tweak it a little bit and it works in live action, it works in film. And they did that. The thing like what I mentioned earlier about the ticking of the clocks, like that's a thing that because they have the extra dimension of audio, they can add that in and make the audience at least be aware of this timer ticking down. I'm not like trying to disparage the movie at all, because I do, like I said, I do like the movie. But once you separate Watchmen from being on the page, it becomes a failure of an adaptation. And even the 2019 show doesn't do what Watchmen the book does. And they had the wherewithal to recognize that they weren't going to, so they made it an entirely new story, which helps. It helps so much. I want to shift our conversation to Ozymandias, because in some ways, like that's the biggest kind of political question this book raises that we haven't gotten into, and we're almost to the. I don't want this episode to go too long, but I do want to ask one last thing about Rorschach, because I picked up on something you're saying, and I'm wondering if I'm like, again, reading my own understanding of 80s politics too much into it. You commented that in the comic book, in the movie, all we know is that Rorschach knows that he's the child of a sex worker. And he kind of seemed to hate his father because his father is like one of these men who's like taking advantage of these horrible women. Like he just hates all of it. And you mentioned how in the comic book, he kind of valorizes his father. One of the things happening in the 80s, one of the biggest political messaging was the attack on single motherhood, particularly in the Black community. And it was seen, there was all sorts of horrible things that were happening. Welfare moms and welfare cheats was the term that was used all the time. Which is even to the point of like when it was the idea that a white woman would do it, it was even more horrible. To the point, literally, like there's a TV show called Murphy Brown that when they showed her character like deciding to be a single mother, which think about it, like today, like if she made that choice, people would be so happy she didn't decide to like terminate the pregnancy. But just her deciding to be a single mother and the show not hating her for it, the vice presidential candidate of the time made it a political issue. And so I'm curious, do you think that that was one more thing that they're commenting on with Rorschach being this child of a white single mother, not a black one, but a white one, and him kind of valorizing the dad he never had?
Yeah.
Kind of more of this, like, the obsession with children who don't have good fathers are going to turn out terrible.
Yeah, and I think Rorschach himself even makes comments like that throughout. At one point in his journal, he talks about his landlord or his landlady, and he refers to her as he says that she has like 5 different kids from 5 different dads, and I'm sure she cheats on welfare, which is a crazy dog whistle, right? Like it's another one of those conservative dog whistles, and you know, like it is a criticism of that kind of like Reagan era. You know, he doesn't say welfare queen, but he might as well.
Yeah.
And I think that it's I don't know the decision behind this. But if a conservative, when people read that, when people read, people mention this to me all the time, because I think that it's very important. When we get into the conversation about Rorschach, right? When I talk about him on TikTok, almost every TikTok that I do about Rorschach does really well because people are incredibly interested in the character. And you know, there's inevitably in the comments, there's an argument where somebody says, you know, like, oh, I don't understand why, you know, people dislike Rorschach. He was the only good one. And then people will say, well, he was racist. And I always have to point out that Rorschach does not say anything explicitly racist throughout the book. And because I think it's really important, I think it is really important to his character that, and our reading of the character, that Rorschach probably is. He probably has some racial prejudices that he might even be unaware of. But I think that needing somebody to come out and say them to be considered racist is a little, I think that's harmful, because then you get somebody like, you know, Donald Trump is clearly racist. Like there is nobody on earth who is a critic of Donald Trump who doesn't think that he is racist. But his fans, his followers,
they'll say he never actually said it, or even
well, he didn't use a racial slur, so he can't be, right.
All the
and
horrible things said at the MSG rally just this past weekend. You know, oh, they were all jokes, they're all misunderstood.
Right? Yeah. So, but to bring that back to what we were talking about before I took the long route there, the people will say, well, doesn't he calls his landlady, you know, basically a welfare queen, and says all this stuff. And I was just like, yeah, that would be a great example of him being racist if the woman wasn't white. And I don't know if they intended for her to be black until they got to the issue where they actually show her, which is like issue 6, I think, 6 or 7. And she's a white woman. I don't know.
Certainly, it's that very, like, I think it's that kind of like, it's very that racially coded language, where it's now even like, oh, how could even a white woman do this thing that we expect mostly from women of color?
And yeah, and I think, but I also think that it is kind of important to the question of morality that is presented in the book, and the you know, shades of gray, and how like there is nobody's all good and all bad kind of morality themes that maybe I like. It's kind of important that Rorschach doesn't actually say anything explicitly racist, because if he does, then he's bad, right? There is no question. There's no discussion about it at that point.
So I want to, we can say so much more on Rorschach, but I do want to touch on Ozymandias some, because again, and maybe that may be its own episode at a later point, the question that he faces of, is it justifiable to do a terrible, terrible thing in order to prevent an existential threat? And Ricky, one thing you and I have talked about a lot on the show is how often what our heroes do when faced with that choice is they find a third option. We're not going to nuke New York City to stop the invasion because the Avengers will be able to save us. You know, we will always find that other option. What was your take, Ricky, on this work where that doesn't happen, and we're left with Ozymandias having done what he's done, and this kind of perspective of that seems horrible. It also perhaps stopped nuclear war, and how do we feel about that?
My take, my lukewarm take, I mean, maybe it's a hot take, is that Ozymandias is a war criminal and he's a villain, and I have no qualms about that. Like, I have no like, oh, like, but he prevented this greater evil. Like, you don't know that. Like, this is, you know, barring time travel or some kind of like mystical power to see fate, we don't know what the future is, right? And my belief is like you should take the actions in the moment that are good, and he took an evil action in the service of what he thinks is the greater good, and I just fundamentally disagree with that kind of morality.
Yeah, I think it's fair. What do you think Alan Moore was trying to say with Ozymandias? Because at least in the movie, I walked away from the movie thinking that we're supposed to think Ozymandias is horrible but did what was necessary, which felt like that feels out of touch with the rest of what I'm learning about Alan Moore and what he's saying in the book. So what do you think, Drew, Alan Moore is actually trying to say with that character?
I think for one, you know, if the main question at the heart of Watchmen is that who watches the Watchmen, the question of who protects you from the person who is supposed to protect you. I think that Alan Moore was trying to, first of all, Alan Moore, anarchist, very left-leaning, you know, outright will tell you that he believes in very far left ideologies. So to him, I think that Ozymandias is supposed to be a criticism of like the quote unquote liberal elite. He's very rich. He's pampered. He's decadent. But he's not a far right conservative. You all mentioned the both of you mentioned Batman earlier. There are shades of Batman in all of these characters, outside of maybe Dr. Manhattan, and to an extent, Silk Spectre as well. You know, one of the main things about Batman is that he's a rich guy, and
you know, and a lot of modern criticism of Batman now is like, why don't you just use your money and build schools and stuff? And you could level the same criticism at Ozymandias.
Right.
It's like, why did you create this conspiracy and like spend all these resources on blowing up a city? And you could have done other stuff.
And the reason is there. The reason why he doesn't do it is because he knows that he truly believes that if he can fund all the schools he wants, but if nuclear armament doesn't get in check, it doesn't matter because those schools are gone. And so I think that he is a criticism of, you know, the idea of the liberal who thinks what they're doing is very progressive, but instead is just buying into conservative ideology without recognizing that they are very conservative because, you know, on the global political spectrum, American liberalism is still, you know, it's right of center.
And part of what I love about that is, especially at that time, but also very much today, but especially at the time, white liberalism was incredibly paternalistic.
Yes.
And talk about the single motherhood thing. It was liberal. It was a Democratic senator, Patrick Moynihan, who kind of wrote this report on like the death of the black family. And a lot of what he wanted was for white people to go and teach black men how to be fathers.
Yeah.
And I mean, like that just drips of every kind of like racist, paternalistic, like, you know, and I think this is where it connects to the Batman part of it is and the who watches the Watchmen part, it's the, if I think this is right, then no one gets to stand in my way.
Right. And you know, like the, you know, him being a rich guy is definitely, that's a commentary on how we view power in America, because it's all about authority. The Watchmen book is all about criticisms of authority. And so like we have this comedian is kind of a might makes right sort of character. Rorschach is a morality makes right sort of character. Ozymandias is the money makes right. Like, who's going to stop him? He has all the resources in the world because he has all this money. And I do think that Ozymandias truly believes that what he's doing is the right thing. And I also believe that another thing that I don't think that they get right in the movie is that in the movie, he looks very like cold and callous and like, oh yeah, I did it. I did what I was supposed to do. And that's it. I'm the best, you know? And in the book, he's just like, I don't know if what I did is right. And I had to teach myself to mourn every single one of these 3 million people I killed, because if I didn't like let myself feel that, then I would be just a monster. And so he tries to humanize himself, but he also can't, because what he's done is unforgivable. But I do think that Alan Moore is kind of essentially saying the only thing that will unite humanity is an enemy. And that's what he gives them. That's what Ozymandias gives them. And it's a very bleak commentary. It's a bleak ending. I happen to be a person who loves bleakness in my literature, so for me it works perfectly. I love the ending to Watchmen.
But let's talk about the difference in the endings, because that is probably the most noticeable change between the graphic novel and the movie.
Because like I said, sorry to interrupt, Rick, I want you to continue, but I watched the movie and thought the movie was saying it's horrible what Ozymandias did, but he probably did what was necessary. And that clearly that's not the intention of the book.
So in the movie, Ozymandias sets up Dr. Manhattan as the fall guy, as the one who led to New York being destroyed.
And he also destroys other leads people to believe that there are other targets around the world. If I'm not mistaken, it's been a while since I've last watched it, but it's either hinted that there are other targets around the world, or he outright does set off explosions in other parts of the world that makes it look like Dr. Manhattan is attacking them as well.
Right.
And in the graphic novel, he has bioengineered an alien-looking life form, like a tentacle monster, that is the source of the disaster. Which is interesting to me as a fan of a lot of 80s anime, is that the space alien as the uniting force that brings humanity together to fight against it is like a very common trope. So I found it very relatable, but I think other people like the Dr. Manhattan ending more.
But I think the Dr. Manhattan ending falls apart under scrutiny, because so much of Dr. Manhattan's character is him disagreeing, but everybody else in the world being like, oh, that's just America's hero. And so like when you make him the face of America, it doesn't matter if he attacked America also. He still is like attacking these other countries. And that's like saying, that's like if the military were to attack all these different places in this coordinated attack, and then also the United States, people around the world would still blame the United States.
Yeah.
So like
100%.
I think that the Dr. Manhattan ending makes sense for the time. The real reason the ending was changed is because they thought that it looked too close to 9/11. That's the real reason. David Hayter, Solid Snake, when he was writing that script, he outright said, I don't want when he was writing the script, first of all, it was closer to 2001. And secondly, he was just like, I don't want to put a 9/11 allegory in this movie and show just bodies in New York on the street because it's just too soon.
Yeah.
So they found a new way to represent it, and it came back to Dr. Manhattan. I think that was Zack Snyder's input, is to have it actually be Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah.
I could be wrong about that though. But yeah, and I mean that's why the change occurred, which makes sense. But at the same time, it's like separating that from Watchmen is, again, it's like, does it work? Because Watchmen needs this completely foreign, alien, non-earthling threat to scare everybody on Earth into working together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I hadn't thought about the Americanness of Dr. Manhattan. I mean, earlier in the story, he literally, quote unquote, wins the Vietnam War,
Yeah.
like, on behalf of America. So yeah, there would be countries that would just be like, haha, like, you lost control of your pet type of thing.
Like, that would not stop the nuclear war, because there is nothing showing these other countries like Russia and, anything that, like, Dr. Manhattan did this to you for a reason or something like that. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
There's nothing there. Dr. Manhattan is sort of just kind of like, oh, this happened. And that's his character. He doesn't really care about humanity anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But you need something that affects the entire world that is not of this world. That cannot be pinned on anybody.
Right.
You could maybe make the argument that because it appeared in New York, well, I guess you can't make that argument. I was going to say because it appeared in New York and other places, it's still New York's fault. But this attack doesn't happen anywhere else in the book. It's only in New York, and it's supposed to be like the whole world believes that it is a squid from an alternate dimension that was called here because some people were doing some science experiments.
Yeah. And I love what we're talking about, because I should give me 1 second to formulate this with the Russians. One of the things that I think, to me, there's two things here. One is that what Alan Moore is doing is 100% accurate, because just look at history since then. The Cold War did end, and we're going to talk about that in the bonus section, because I have some feelings about how that affects the movie translation. But and for 8 years, we had this sort of like the end of history idea, which was ridiculous. But then the moment we had the first World Trade Center bombing, like at first we were starting to be like, okay, but now China's the enemy. And like, but when Bush Jr. was elected, he was critiquing Clinton for being soft on China. And then there was that World Trade Center attack, the first one. The 9/11. And all of a sudden, that became the thing that we could unite America against. And there's been a lot of discussion about how a lot of the Bush policies, and then unfortunately continued by Obama and then Trump. I was on an airplane this morning. I went through a whole bunch of security in order to prevent things that happened 20 years ago, 23 years ago, that are widely understood to not be threats in the same way anymore. But we continue that security theater to remind us that there is this threat that all of us are against.
Yeah.
Look at Israel, where, you had massive political divisions, and the president perhaps about to be thrown out of office, the prime minister about to be thrown out of office and arrested, and fighting with the court system. And then when there was this admittedly horrific attack, it became, oh, this is the thing that can unite all of us Israelis against this, and that's, I'm not singling out that one country. That happens all the time.
Sure. And it will continue to happen.
Yeah.
It is
until the actual aliens come.
Until the actual aliens come. Yeah. This is something that will continue to happen until, I don't know when it would stop, but I'm always, I'm the kind of guy, I love Watchmen so much that I see it in everything because it's been such a it has been such a massively influential piece of work. When I go to the movies right now, they're heavily advertising the Wicked adaptation. And there's that line in the Wicked trailer where the wizard says, if you want to bring people together, you got to give them a real good enemy. And like every time I hear that, I go, oh, that's Watchmen.
Yeah.
Like that is what Watchmen is that is the thesis that comes at the end of Watchmen, is that if we really want unity, we all have to hate and be afraid of the same thing.
Which is so ironic because one of the other ideas that, Ozymandias is working on is this idea of universal energy, and that would unite the world.
And that's only in the movie as well.
Oh, okay. 'Cause I was gonna say that's the Star Trek idea to that question. Is what unites people is if we are no longer fighting over resources.
This is the thing, is that that's in the movie because he needs to have that be the cover for what he's working on.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Because they couldn't do all of the setup that it takes to explain this alien so that it doesn't just come out of nowhere is all throughout the book. And it's kind of a similar thing, that it's like not necessarily he's working on, but like this company is working on throughout the book in the background.
Right. So let me throw one last thing out for discussion, and you can both tell me I'm nuts for this.
You're nuts.
Exactly.
All right.
I'll wait for the question.
When I hear Ozymandias saying, look, this is a terrible thing I'm doing, but I believe it has to be done. And so I'm going to do it, and I'm not going to let anyone else stop me. What I hear is, when you know that you're right, you say, no, you move. Captain America declaring, like, I know that I'm right, and to hell with anybody else who thinks I'm wrong. And Captain America is clearly someone we can trust to say that. But the reason I've always been a little bit more Team Tony in that movie, and not to relitigate that, but is I see a direct line between Captain America and Ozymandias. I see we can, I'm willing to trust Captain America with that, but if we give him that, we're also giving it to Ozymandias, because isn't Ozymandias basically saying the same thing? Everyone else thinks I'm wrong, but I know I'm right, so I'm going to make them move.
You're nuts.
I think that so you're talking about that line from the Civil War movie,
right?
Whereas, like, when I think of that line, I think of the Civil War book, and the Civil War comic. A lot of people don't like. I happen to really like it.
I like it.
It is not well regarded by a lot of people.
Really?
For the same reasons why every book would be not well regarded, where it's like, oh, you're making this character act how they wouldn't. And I'm a big proponent of, like, the characters are so flexible that you can you can make them mold them to your story rather than try to whatever, keep them static.
But there's limits. You can't make Spider-Man denigrate hippies, but I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, these days you can make Captain America say "Hail Hydra."
Well, anyway, so back to this question, like the Captain America and Ozymandias.
So I think that when the context of that comic panel is very important, which Civil War is. It is a commentary on the Patriot Act,
right?
And so, like, Tony saying, or Steve saying, when you're right, you tell the whole world, no, you move, has to be linked to this idea of, like, the denigration of American values. Right. And so putting it in that context, I don't necessarily see it as the same as what I think on the surface they're very similar ideas, but I think once you actually dig into, like, what is being said, because
I guess maybe a better way to say what I'm saying is, because I get that, and I also think that that's one of the things about art is that something is written in a particular context, and then 20 years later we can say, okay, maybe that was a good idea then, but it's problematic now.
Yeah.
I feel like Steve is saying no one should watch the Watchmen. The Avengers can know what is right, and we shouldn't have any oversight.
I don't necessarily agree, although I can see the math for how you got there. I think the reason why I disagree is because in Watchmen, Ozymandias is clearly like an authority figure.
Right.
Whether he wants to be or not, he is, he's the rich, he's the elite, he's the corporate masters of the United States which pretty much gives him all the power. The irony of, him being just a man, yet he manages to have more power than Dr. Manhattan, who's the most powerful being in the universe. Right. But with that line from Captain America, he's using it in retaliation or in response to the government, who has more authority than he does. Ozymandias instead is kind of, he is the upper echelon of authority as laid out by the Watchmen book.
Right.
Captain America is at least standing up to somebody above him. And so that's why I think that there are differences.
That does make sense. Yeah, it's a big difference.
But I can definitely see what you mean. It taken out of that context, it does look like let's lay it all out on the table. If the story from from Civil War is real and superheroes really exist and like this terrible tragedy happens on their watch, yeah, regulate them. Please regulate them. We need the government regulation of these people, but there's also the question of like, they are private citizens.
Right.
So,
and I think that's where the context changes, because like you said, the book came out in the context of the Patriot Act. For me, the movie comes out and the time may not exactly line up, maybe a couple of years later, but like, I can't help see it without looking at it through the lens of police violence.
Yeah.
And of like the attempt to oversight that and things like that.
Right. Right.
Riki, you started off though with a quick "you're nuts." You can jump in on this too.
Well, my "you're nuts" is that you're trying to connect the dots between the two characters being like unshakably confident in their own actions, but then you have to evaluate the actions that they take. And as Drew said, Captain America's actions are in defiance of an authority trying to control him. Right. Which is very different than Ozymandias' actions, which is, again, I'll say, a war crime or a crime against humanity.
Well, but he's saying it in that context, but he's also saying it in the context of, no, you don't get to regulate what Scarlet Witch did, even though she did something accidental that wound up killing people and doing a lot of damage. I guess, because here's the thing is, like I said, I do trust him with that power. It's that. And to be clear, I think one of the ways that the Civil War movie, at least, often gets really messed up in discussion is it starts with this philosophical discussion of should there be no oversight or should there be oversight or not? And then it quickly becomes, should it become this very bad kind of oversight? And that individual philosophical question that I really care about is lost in that. And I'm by no means defending all the stuff that happens in the movie. And I think you're right. It's a very different context. I guess just for me,
and we're getting a little bit too far into Civil War, which is
agreed.
A very different subject.
Yeah, pull it back. All I meant was that for me, there's a line in The West Wing that I really love, where it says that he thinks that there are very few absolute rights and very few absolute wrongs, and that when people think there are, they tend to come with body counts. And I'm terrified of certainty. I think that level of certainty that Captain America has is honorable and moral and terrifying. And I guess that's to me the link I see with Ozymandias is I feel like that I think Ozymandias would look at Captain America and say, I'm doing what he did. And I think you're right. It's not the same, but that's just the connection, I guess, that I see.
But I also think that you're right about that, is that Ozymandias would look at somebody who was defiant against or who stood up to something and knew that they were right. And he would just be like, yeah, it's the same thing. And a character like Rorschach for all his hypocrisy, would look at it and be like, no, it's not the same thing.
Yeah.
He's not killing people. You did. Again, hypocrisy, because Rorschach kills people all the time. And that's ultimately what Ozymandias is supposed to do as a character, is to point out this hypocrisy. I guess he's a number of things he's supposed to do, but he is supposed to be there to be like, point out that like, oh, Rorschach kills a person, maybe a couple dozen over the course of his superhero career. Ozymandias is responsible for the death of 3 million. Right. But when it comes down to it, what's the difference? Because taking a life is still taking a life. And both of them think that they're doing it for the betterment of humanity. Yeah. And the comedian is the one in the middle who's just like, yeah, nobody's life matters. That's the ultimate joke. Right. We were all put on this earth for no reason. And that's hilarious to me, And so it's funny that Rorschach looks up to the comedian, but he doesn't like Ozymandias. And the reason he doesn't like Ozymandias is because he is rich, he is liberal, and he's possibly gay. And that's again more hypocrisy on Rorschach's part.
Gotcha. Well, there's so much more we could talk about this. Drew, this has been fantastic. I definitely want to have you back. We're going to have a little bit of a bonus section talking primarily about the kind of a book set during the 1980s and then turned into a movie that's not, and how it's adapted and things like that. But for both of you, any just last things you want to say or comments you want to give?
If you want to hear me talk more about Watchmen,
I mean, I have a whole thing. I don't know how much longer you want to give me.
Well, what I was going to say is if your listeners want to hear me talk more about Watchmen, I do a TikTok series called Drew Watches the Watchmen, which is all about which is how I just me breaking down analyzing the book, the characters, everything that you could possibly think of. I have either talked about or would like to talk about at some time. I haven't gotten into like Before Watchmen and the Rorschach spinoff and some of like the movie necessarily and the TV show, but I plan to, as long as I can think of something to say about it. On top of that, DC, Warner Brothers, just released an animated adaptation of the first half of Watchmen Chapter 1. I watched it and I recorded an audio commentary for people who want to hear me talk about the changes between the two.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's totally, you can get access to that. All you have to do is make a donation of any amount to the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. Send me an email with a screenshot of the receipt showing that you made the donation at drewwatchesthewatchman@gmail.com, and I will send you a link to it so you can watch that movie and listen to me yap more about Watchmen to your heart's content.
Awesome. And all the links to that will be in the show notes. Cool. And like I said, I've been following the TikToks for a while. Show note. So I was trying to do a last comment that people had. I'll move that what you just said to. I'll do and now Drew, let me give you a chance to kind of promote things. So let me just kind of do the re-enter to that.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Well, we've already gone over time, but I'm not surprised at all. And Riki, I know there's been a couple of things you've been wanting to. Let me do that. Well, we're already been pretty long, but I know I've been kind of driving the conversation a lot. Riki, what else do you want to get into or comment on before we wrap up?
So when I was thinking about the Watchmen, I started looking into the history, the publication. The original graphic novels were published 1986 to 87.
Mm-hmm.
And then the movie was released in 2009. And what I found most interesting about this was that Iron Man, the movie, came out in 2008, just a year before. So we've talked about how the Watchmen graphic novel was a commentary, a critique of comic books, which at that point had, decades of history.
Mhm.
Whereas Watchmen the movie didn't really have, like, there was the Batman, Tim Burton Batman movies, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, but what we now, like in 2024, see as comic book movies, right? The MCU had barely just started.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
that's so
I
interesting.
I came to like this thesis that Watchmen the movie just came out too early. Not that it was like ahead of its time in what it was doing, but that the things that it needed to comment on just hadn't happened yet.
Yeah, I agree with
Yeah.
that. Absolutely. I think that if it had come out, let's say it came out 2019, 10 years later, I think that they probably could have had more material to work with and make it very apparent that it was a commentary on superhero movies.
Yeah.
And borrow from some of these storytelling techniques of film of various superhero movies and stuff like that. But yeah, the material really wasn't there yet.
Mhm.
And there are some people who would say that it is a commentary on superhero films.
Well, it's a
I
commentary on movies because they use like the Flight of the Valkyries music for the
from yeah
Vietnam
from
sequence, which is from
Apocalypse Now.
Apocalypse Now.
And then having the having Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen as the music over the sex scene also feels like such an interesting choice in
Yeah.
that same kind of a way.
So it does do a good job of using the audio-ness of movies,
Mhm.
but also of like utilizing what was in movie media at the time available to it. But
Yeah.
I really do think, like, do I want a reboot of Watchmen? Not really, but I think it kind of, like, if anything deserves, quote unquote
Yeah.
deserves it, like it would be interesting to see a new Watchmen movie comment on the MCU.
Yeah.
It's gonna happen eventually. It's
Yeah,
gonna
because
happen
money.
eventually. Yeah.
For
It would
sure.
make a lot of money.
All right. Well, this has been fantastic, Drew. Thank you again. For people who are really excited about the stuff you've had to say, tell me more about where they can find you, and then I'll insert all the stuff you said earlier.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Should I just throw it in?
Yeah.
I also I am an aspiring comic book writer. I've written some stuff here and there, but I get to make my professional comics debut on December 4th.
Oh, that's amazing.
A story that I wrote for a DC anthology will be released in their holiday special this year.
That's awesome.
So it's a story it's a story that I wrote, art by a really incredible Italian artist. Her name is Mariana Ignazzi. You got a couple, a pretty big name. Marv Wolfman is doing a Dead Man story as like kind of the anchor story. I'm really excited for it to come out. So if you're listening to this and you like stuff that I have to say, go read it and then tell DC that they should give me more work.
Can we pre-order that?
You can at your local comic shop.
Okay. Awesome. Yes. Well, again, we'll have all the information about that in the show notes. Well, to both of you, thank you so much. To our listeners, stick around. We're going to have a bonus section about thoughts I have about adapting it to a non-Cold War audience. But I have myself, all three of us. Thank you so much. We have spoken. Welcome back, members. So here's the question that I have always had about this movie and why I think, in part, the movie didn't strike me very hard. And I'm wondering if this is just a me problem or and that newer generations aren't going to think about it this way, or what you have to say about it. And as contrast, I'm going to contrast the movie adaptation with V for Vendetta, another great book by Alan Moore that was turned into what is probably my favorite superhero movie of all time, or certainly vigilante movie. But in it, one of the things they did is said, okay, this book is written against the background of the Cold War and of all the fear of that. And that's not true anymore. So we're going to update it to be a fear of, Muslims and queer people and all that kind of stuff. I think the queer people thing is definitely in the original for sure. But the more Muslim idea. As I was watching this movie, I was feeling like I don't get it, because the movie was telling me that the Cold War is by definition going to end in nuclear war, and therefore Ozymandias has to consider this horrible option. But I know that it didn't. I lived through it. I lived through the end of the Cold War. It didn't end in a nuclear war. And I'm kind of curious your thoughts on, like, is it essential that this be a 1980s story, or would it make sense maybe to adapt it to, like, make it, set in more modern day where it's about, a confrontation with Iran or, something else like that?
I don't know. I think that the 1980s setting really has to make sense for it, or really has to be there for it to make sense. I think that, you can say like, oh, I know that the Cold War didn't end in nuclear, or the 80s didn't end with a nuclear war, right? That nuclear war never came. You also don't know that it's going to come in the book. Like in the book and in the movie, like the characters don't know that. But there's also, I think the issue then is that Watchmen has an alternate history as well, where
Nixon has been elected to a third term, right? Or is he running for a third term?
It's a sixth term.
Oh, okay. My God. So
yeah,
Nixon is king.
So I love talking about the alternate history in Watchmen too. So Nixon makes the decision to send Dr. Manhattan to Vietnam. The Viet Cong surrender to him. Vietnam becomes the 51st state. And because of Nixon's decision to do that, they repeal the amendment that keeps, says that presidents can only serve 2 terms. And so he just keeps running for president. There's all kinds of like alternate history going on here. Dr. Manhattan creates, Dr. Manhattan produces synthetic lithium just out of nowhere that allows electric cars to become possible by 1985. So nobody drives a gas powered car in 1985.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Every car is electric. Everything down to like he created a technology that allows cigarettes to still give you a nicotine buzz, but they actually clean your lungs as you smoke them. Because of this alternate history, I think that we can reasonably assume that there is an alternate future to these characters as well.
Yeah, that's fair.
And so, yeah, like I think obviously like it coming out in 1986, but being set in 1985 is more poignant than us looking, in 2009 or 2019 or 2024, looking back in the 80s and kind of being like, oh yeah, well, we know that didn't happen. The characters don't know that though. And that's other than Dr. Manhattan. Dr. Manhattan probably has a reasonable idea that this didn't happen, but he can't necessarily tell anybody that it's not going to happen because he is bound by time. People always ask questions about Dr. Manhattan. Why didn't he stop it? Why didn't he do this? Why didn't he do that? And the frustrating answer is he doesn't, so he didn't.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's just the way, because his past and his present and his future are all happening to him at the same time. So he just doesn't do those things.
Right.
No,
and I like what you said about the alternate history. I think that does change it somewhat. But I would say to listeners, if we have listeners who read this, because I like I said, I remember that time, but I was still fairly young. I was like 10 years old. I wasn't reading books like this, but I'd love to hear if we have any listeners who are a little older who did read this book at the time, what it was like when it was still in doubt whether or not the Cold War would end in nuclear obliteration.
I tell you what, I have never met a person who read Watchmen as it was coming out, and I'm too young to have been there.
Right.
So I would love to speak to somebody, literally anybody, who was like picking Watchmen up monthly as it was coming out, because in my mind, it's like the first issue comes out and a lot of people don't read it, but maybe some do because Alan Moore is a big name at that point, and like Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons have collaborated together, so like, oh, it's cool to see them working again.
Right.
But then like by issue 4, it's like a phenomenon because word of mouth has just spread. And in my mind, that's like how it worked. And I just want to know if I'm correct. And if somebody can just like tell me about the like the energy that was buzzing around in the comic sphere around when Watchmen came out.
Ricky, I'm gonna let you have the last word. Wrap us up.
Well, to me, to answer your question, the character of Nixon, Richard Nixon, I think is very important to this story because of the alternate history of it. Not just that it presents it like clearly as an alternate history, but that having Nixon, you said like 6th term, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what it felt like in the 80s, but from my perspective, like Nixon was a terrible president, a dangerous president. And the idea of him like becoming basically king of America makes it believable that the Cold War would reach this much more of a boiling point, where the threat of nuclear, mass mutual destruction was in play.
I also think that something that's real important is the nuclear deterrence of the story of Watchmen are, like essentially Dr. Manhattan and the comedian to a lesser extent, because he'll do these like covert missions. That's what he's doing at the beginning of the book when the beginning of the book. The thing that gets him killed is that he was on a covert mission and he was coming back and he discovered this whole plot because he thought he saw some like communists in like South America or something like that. And so like you have these nuclear deterrents, these government like extra normal operatives, as they're referred to in the book, who essentially are there just to be like, no, you can never nuke us.
Right.
And their presence in general, like their presence, I think the book reasonably claims that them being there at all is going to make people want to fire the missiles.
Yeah.
Then when you take them out of the equation completely, what happens?
Which, to give you more context, this is the age of Ronald Reagan attempting to build an anti-nuclear missile shield that he called Star Wars. That was supposed to be exactly that we could defend it. And I'll just close with what Rika, hearing you talk about that really helped something click for me, which I think it's for me. And again, I want to hear from listeners of all different ages, but I wonder for anyone else growing up, being a kid during the Reagan Cold War, and also knowing that Nixon was horrible and terrible and did all sorts of awful things, also ushered in a lot of that détente of the 70s and kind of, made rapprochement with China and with the Soviet Union. If you told me in 1985 who's more dangerous, President Nixon or President Reagan, I would have said President Reagan a million times. So that again, it may just be like different perspectives in how we read it. It may just be that.
But again, it's the alternate history. Like,
yeah, no,
we're talking about a Nixon who won the Vietnam War thanks to Dr. Manhattan. Right. Like the Nixon we have in real history was the one who had to admit defeat. So he was like very humbled. So he was like looking for solutions to kind of fix his own image. Right.
And this is also a Nixon who sends a government agent. It's heavily implied, that he sends a government agent to kill Woodward and Bernstein. So the story of Watergate never comes out. Nobody ever hears about it.
And again, all of that is the intellectual side. All I'm saying is that for me watching the movie, my emotional reaction is Nixon's not so scary, certainly not against Reagan. And I just think it's an interesting way of but hearing you guys, your other perspectives, I think really helps me understand like, okay, actually, no, this does work, even though we know because it's an alternate history and all of that. Well, all right. Thank you guys both so much. This has been a fantastic discussion. To our members, thank you. This has been such a great experience. You make it possible. Thank you so much for your membership. We have spoken.